the wife of my boss said, "Steve, you have a phone call in the kitchen." It was 10 o'clock at night. I went into the kitchen, answered the phone, put the phone to my ear, and the words I heard I will never forget. "Mr. Olds, I.M. Pei here." That phone call changed my life. That phone call meant that I was going to be drawing, not designing, primarily as an architect. And you know what? It's okay. That was a good phone call. My name is Steve Olds, and I'm an architect who got sidetracked. An architectural project is typically begun as a very vague and amorphous idea, the architect's head. The task of the architectural illustrator in general is to take all of the material that's available at the time and translate that into something which is representational, photographic, if you will, something that the lay people can understand, and also something that the architect himself or herself can understand as well. My intention always has been to communicate the intention of the architecture. That's something which is beyond the graphic. It's something that Hugh Ferris referred to as the spirit. That's what made the pursuit of a graphic career worthy enough to undertake. So that phone call led quickly to a series of meetings where I.M. Pei said to me that I want this project, that is the National Gallery of Art East Building, all drawn in one hand, and I want that hand to be yours. So for the next 2.5 years, I spent a lot of time in New York in I.M. Pei's office working with the design team on the design of the National Gallery East Building project, which was at that time Pei's capstone. The first drawing, done in 1969, was done so well that the client said, "That's exactly what we want. I.M. don't change a thing." This turned out to be an example of a drawing done too well, because it overwhelmed the intention of the architect. I.M. said, "No, that's not what we want. It's too dark, it's too closed, we need to open it up." So for the next year or so, a series of 9 or 10 drawings that I did as a consultant there showed various degrees of opening of the ceiling, opening of the roof of the National Gallery. And all of this was done prior to the advent of the computer. Some people imagine that the computer can do everything. That could not be farther from the truth. Actually, what one still has to do is have the idea and pursue the idea with much of the same discipline and in many of the same parameters that you do as a traditional artist. The computer is just a tool. Some tools are easier to use than other tools. And as it turns out, a few software, SketchUp certainly among them, is very natural, very intuitive, and gets in the way much less. Drawing is something I love to do. It has served me well. I think it's served the profession well. And I would have to say, at this late point in my career, I'm extremely happy with the way things have turned out. I probably could have done nothing else quite as well as I do what I do.
Steve Olds, I'm proud to say, is a graduate of this college. And he's also a graduate of Yale. I think he'll talk a little bit about that. And he's also a Loeb Fellow at Harvard. He's also the co-founder of the American Society of Illustrators.
Architectural Illustrators.
Architectural Illustrators.
There you go.
ASAI. Yeah,
ASAP.
And it was at one time ASP, right?
ASAP, right.
Perfectionist. So it brings great pleasure for me personally, as well as pride in our college, to introduce Steve Olds to you. But I want to make one comment. He would probably defer to Hugh Ferris, and I appreciate that. But for me, Steve is the preeminent architectural illustrator of the 20th century. And I am proud to have Steve here. So, Steve.
Thank you. I've turned on the remote control mic. Does it work? Can you hear me? That's good to know. Andy, I don't know what to say, except you're right, I would defer to Hugh Ferris, but I certainly appreciate that very much, obviously. I'm glad you got to see the video first, because I don't have to go over a lot of that territory. I've said it as well as I could for the video team that showed up at my house last September. I learned a lot about how videos are made, and believe me, the 2.5 days of effort it took to get 4.5 minutes was kind of an awakening experience for me, but I think they did a very good job. This was a group out of Denver, and it was sponsored obviously by SketchUp, with which I have a very, very cordial relationship. Is this going to be okay for the video as far as placement? I won't move much. I knew that as I was going from the 20th century to the 21st, that I was going to have to learn the world of the digital. So my first effort was with Mac Perspective, which was a very, very primitive software, modeling software. Then I graduated to Form Z. Has anybody in here suffered with Form Z? Yes, well, you know what I mean. You know, you memorize a catalog, a manual, and then another thicker one comes out, and you've got the task to do all over. So I was so happy when in 2001, SketchUp came on the scene, because it's so intuitive. You can learn it in the basics really in 5 minutes and just start having fun. It knows what you want to do because it was made by Texans. A couple of guys at Rice University cooked it up, and I have been in love with this software ever since. And they apparently are in love with me too, because as you see, if anybody has used SketchUp, I assume they have, you know that when you open the template, there is a scale figure, a scale avatar, a two-dimensional caricature of somebody, and they're always real people, but they've always been real people in the firm. This was a complete shock and a thorough delight to me when I was notified that I'd been chosen as the first out-of-house SketchUp scale avatar, and there it is. So when my wife was watching me, and when I was sort of cooking up the final version of this with the people in Boulder, and she looked down and she said, "He's hot." So that made me feel kind of good, and I was, kind of feeling a little bit. She looked up and she said, "Not you, Jerko, the avatar." So you take what you can get. But anyway, if you do have the 2015 version of SketchUp, well, I will be there for usually about 15 nanoseconds before I'm deleted, which every avatar I've been told by the 3 prior avatars, I've been told that that's your 15 microseconds of fame. As I say, we take what we can get. Let's see, does this advance? No, I have to point it over there, and yes, it does. I titled this chat, and I hope it's interactive. There'll be some time at the end of the talk to kick around anything you would like to. Your double T, I think I don't have to explain that. It's more than just a semiotic abbreviation for an institution. It is your alma mater and mine. And I was just thinking of the most important things that I could imagine that the two T's might stand for. And one is talent, which we all have some of, some more than others. And the other is tenacity, which is, I think, speaking as an old geezer looking back at fresh faces, probably about the most important lesson that I've learned in the 50-some-odd years that I've been out there in the world trying to get things done. Tenacity is absolutely the key. It is teachable, according to a New York Times article, which I'll show you in a minute. I think it's learnable. My father, for instance, believed in deferred or, in some cases, denied gratification. So I learned about sticking to what I wanted to get done fairly early on, and apparently that is something which is, it's a non-cognitive skill which is teachable, again, according to people who are smarter than I am. During the time I was here, it was the twilight of the Beaux-Arts. Florian Kleinschmidt was not a museum at the time. He was a very persuasive, very large person, a presence at Texas Tech. He had been trained at the École des Beaux-Arts and believed that we students should all have to learn what he had had to learn. And that, of course, includes the graded ink wash, which used all the traditional materials, Whatman's glue, vegetable glue, Whatman's paper, and learning how to stay within the lines, which was very important. It was not a joke. And this was the first exercise, which I seem to have done reasonably well on. There's a little B+ in the corner there. But still not really quite enough. So exercise 2 gave me another chance, and I still couldn't get better than the B+. This was graded on gradation, and you can see the marks here where I didn't quite get the absolute proportion between tones. But what I do realize is that much later in life, I developed a system which I referred to as the value delineation process. And that is the subtitle to my first book. And this is where it came from. There's no question that the absolute acute consciousness of tonal drawing started right here. So this is the seed that really led to the work you see upstairs. Now there are a whole series of exercises that I'll show you quickly that I went through in the first particularly 2 years here. I was not supposed to be an architect. My father was a geologist, and he said, "Thou shalt be a petroleum engineer. Go to Texas Tech, sign up for petroleum engineering, and you'll always be able to make a living." Well, this was before the advent of the bumper stickers that admonish you or invoke you to question authority. It was the 50s. It was my father. I didn't question authority. I just did what I was told, except in this case. Because I was a student, I was a resident in Sneed Hall, which is where all the freshmen were. And I looked up and down the hall, and the engineers, the person I was supposed to become, would have their door festooned with a little tiny card, a very appropriate card in the little metal holder that said, you know, XYZ, I'm engineer, a double E, whatever. But the architects' doors are full of stuff, you know, outrageous things, smarmy things, salacious things. I mean, this was, you know, and I'm thinking to myself, which one of these people do I want to be? So I secretly changed majors. I was very, very afraid to face my father with this, but after a year and a half, I received an award I didn't even know existed. It was called Outstanding Sophomore, and it came with a certificate. So I went to my father holding the certificate as a shield. And I said, Dad, I've changed majors. And of course, he blew up for about 20 seconds and he said, well, I guess you're doing okay. I guess so. I don't know. So the rest, as they say, is history. But I was determined not to be a petroleum engineer. And thank God I followed that determination. Well, this was one of the exercises that in the design option, as it was called then, there was a construction option as well, that was done. Of course, this was before computers, which meant that you didn't just do a unit and replicate it. You had to paint every single one. This must have taken a week and a half to do. And it was really an exercise, again, in staying within the lines, and of course, with designing the original unit as well. We then graduated to color. This is a color version of the same pattern. Happily, they did not make us do the whole pattern again. It was one of the minor blessings of that year. Color was taken very seriously, and it was taught very early on. This is a kind of a poor projection, but you can get the idea of a relationship of value and chroma, which has served me extremely well in the rest of my life, as many things I learned during that time have done. Color and composition. This must be terribly amusing to you really cool dudes and chicks here, because these were the tools of the time. I mean, okay, yeah, you recognize the stylized T-square, that's, you know, good old dividers. Every engineer at Texas Tech at that point had a leather slide rule case hanging from his, and it was all his, of course, in those days, belt. I mean, way prior to the calculator, certainly prior to the computer, certainly way, way, way prior to the iPhone. Those are the tools of the day, including the thumbtack, if you pick that up. So that was an exercise in composition, but happily, finally, we went back to the pencil, which is the only thing I knew anything about coming here. And this was another exercise in composition, which was, the task was to make a picture that somehow communicated your initials. So if you could see the PSO in there, you're probably better than almost anybody else. Well, now I've told you, you probably can. But apparently somebody liked it because it finally got my, finally got a good grade. Talk about a perfectly classic Beaux-Arts exercise. This was a bust of de Medici. What's his first name? Lorenzo. Lorenzo, thank you very much. De Medici in light by pencil, and this was my attempt to capture Lorenzo. Not too bad. There was something in the signature that I'll talk about in just a minute. There was never an architectural rendering course per se given here, but this came about as close as anything did. This was done in pencil, and it was a fictitious, I didn't have to tell you that, office group with unbelievable, egregious liberties taken with perspective. I look at this now and I sort of have to apologize, but still, it was an exercise, early exercise in rendering architecture. But still, we were not free of the ink wash because the ink version is shown here. This was back to exercise 1, practically. Well, it was spring of 1957, and I was in Bradshaw's Methods and Materials class, and Bradshaw could go on and on and on. He was really boring. A lot of very good information. I owe a lot to dear Mr. Bradshaw. But at that point, I was interested really pretty much in two things, girls and cars. And I think there's no question that I was better at drawing one than the other. There was also, I was a member of the service fraternity Alpha Phi Omega, which probably doesn't exist anymore. Is it toast here? But those are the things that I was interested in at the moment in April of 1957. So much life drawing. We were given freehand drawing, we were given watercolor drawing, pen and ink drawing, and just life drawing and life drawing and life drawing, which was wonderful. And people say, well, look, why so much life drawing? Just so you can draw scale figures? Well, not really. I mean, there's a little bit more to it than that. But this was the beginning of my love affair with black paper and white figure. Composition was also always shot through every single assignment as an important consideration. And this series of 3 gestural drawings went together in a way that was as important as the individual drawings themselves. I had a girlfriend, and that's very good. I'll tell you later why it was good. This is Patsy, and Patsy was at work here, and Patsy was always at work. She was an allied art major, and she was very cute. You'll see this later. I was very cute, too. But as I say in the video, I just love to draw. I always have. And why not draw the person you love? So that was Patsy, and she now has the original to this. So she's living in Prescott, Arizona. She has more grandkids than you can count. And her name now is Pat, of course. Pat. And she is an artist. She, in fact, does very good painting. This is another life drawing, and this was, I think, a good example of one of my favorite media combinations at the time, which was Conte crayon and chalk on toned paper. So apparently, again, you might see the little tiny A at the bottom. Somebody liked it as well. And of course, we had to try all kinds of media. This is pen and ink. And is anybody in this room sharp enough to know how this was done? Because I'll give you a clue. I'm right-handed. Yeah, you got it. Had to be in a mirror. But I think the greatest service done by having to do pen and ink drawing was that I knew I never wanted to do it again. I actually did this rendering of a building that may be familiar to you in pen and ink, but I never have used pen and ink for an architectural rendering in my whole professional career, because it's very difficult to get value gradation. It's very difficult to change things. It's quite unforgiving. It's very archival, and it's very photographable. But those are its 2 major advantages. This is another example. I think you can tell in the folds of the fabric how difficult it is to get any kind of subtle, particularly mid-gray gradations in pen and ink. Still lifes were the order of the day. This was our first venture into watercolor still life. Not representational, that would take too much time, but sort of, excuse me, the task was to abstract the essence of the still life, and this was my attempt to do that. I also did, on my own, try to do some representational, some sort of real watercolor painting. This was at the corner of one of the dorms looking over to some of the other dorms. It's a little hard to find a really romantic subject on the Tech campus, then and maybe even possibly now. Excuse me, the water in the foreground, speaking of water, it's up here somewhere. Oh, there we go, thank you. In the foreground was kind of the only opportunity I had to do something which would sort of recall watercolor. It's funny because I'll talk a little later about the American Society of Architectural Perspectivists and the Hugh Ferris Prize, which is now 29 years old. We have 29 winners. And almost all of them have some sort of water or reflectivity in the foreground. That's a tip for anybody who's interested. So I applied that, of course, to my assignments, my project. This was architect's house, architect's residence. The program said it was an architect married to a poet. I tried that. I married a poet from New York, worked for 27 years, but then, you know, as I said to several people, be careful about marrying somebody from New York. But it was obviously a great homage to Scottsdale. I mean, this is Taliesin light. I obviously I was and still am a great Frank Lloyd Wright inspiree, follower, and believer. And it was my intention when I graduated to replace Wright, who had just died, but that sort of didn't quite work out. But you get the idea. But that was a third-year project. This was life painting, these are examples of work that I probably could not do now. I mean, I was better then in watercolor, I think, than I am now. Here's another one. And don't make fun of the bathing suits. It was the 50s. It was Texas. And, you know, draw your own conclusions. I loved opaque medium in the form of particularly white tempera on black field. Richard Tracy was my instructor for sculpture, and this was actually something that I keep in my office to this very day. It was an animal sculpture that was done under Tracy's guidance. Tracy had apparently something of a hair lip and had some speech difficulties and was mercilessly mocked behind his back. But looking back, Richard, or as we call him, Dick Tracy, of course, was one of the most consequential teachers I had at Tech. Betsy Sasser and Dick Tracy were really the two teachers to whom I owe the most. So this is my remembrance of Richard Tracy. And then there's the thesis. There's somebody in this room, I think, who actually thought this was a good project. That kind of narrows it down because there are not many people in this room who were in that room at that time. I was really glad to hear that because it apparently was pretty underwhelming because it didn't get a great grade. But I started late. I'm not going to go into it, but I was on I only had two-thirds of the schedule to do it. And it was was the best I could do in the time. Now, the person around whom I have my arm, that is the person then I had my arm, was Patsy, again, my girlfriend. And if it had not been for her, I would have never finished the model of the thesis. So we've gone our separate ways, obviously, but I'm indebted forever to her for the help she gave in finishing that complex model, which is the most complicated model I ever did, you know, then or now. The guy on the left is now called Jay. He was then Jerry Jones. Again, there's one person in this room who would recognize him. And I met him many years later, just through serendipity, in Boston, where he was working at the firm that I had just left. And he worked for many years as a practicing architect, and then became a gallery painter. He now sells his work and is a respected painter in oil in the Boston area. I just talked to him about a week ago, and he offered his best wishes to anybody here. And as I say, there's one person to whom is an appropriate recipient of those good wishes. This is a then and now. This is the way we were, Patsy and me, in 1960, which is when I graduated, and about 5 years ago. And this was in Santa Fe. We're still good friends. We still have communication. I asked if she could be here for this talk. She said, well, I'm kind of busy, and I understand that. So I say she lives in Arizona. Even though my thesis was somewhat underwhelming, I'd had some good years, and so I was awarded the AIA medal as, I guess you could say, top of the class. I think it was highest grade point average or something. I don't know exactly why, but that helped me very much get my first job, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because we will go to the second. It's not the second half, because the first part is 2/3 and the second part is 1/3. So it is what time? Yeah, I think we're all right. So I was curious about this idea of tenacity, talent, not versus, but talent and tenacity, because it's really kind of an inversely proportional equation. The less you have of one, the more you need of the other. And as a person who's not long on talent myself, I found that making it up with the tenacity side was what I really needed to do. And the degree to which I have succeeded in my career is really due much more to the second T than the first. I think it's interesting that tenacity really requires more space in the thesaurus than talent does. Talent is kind of simpler. You either have it or you don't. It's possible to gain it in certain ways, so it's arguable. But tenacity also is teachable, as I mentioned, but there are more synonyms for it. It's more complicated. It actually is a large part of character. And there will be a quote about character in the next slide. Characters, according to the New York Times earlier this month, and this was cited by David Brooks, who's my favorite columnist in the Times, from John Gardner, that you can read it, the world loves talent, but pays off on character. So character isn't synonymous with tenacity, but tenacity is in there. Focus, resolve, conscientiousness, all of those things are, I think, part of character. And those things are where the world pays off, or at least so claims Mr. Gardner, and I'm inclined to agree with him. In another New York Times piece a little more recently, the term tenacity comes up, and of course the Texas interpretation of the term is grit. We love monosyllables in this state, right? Tenacity is kind of an East Coast term, and grit is more, that's more Texas Tech. And I agree, I love those short terms too. But this, I thought, was exactly the point I was trying to make. To hang in, to keep going, and to stick with it is, if there is a single secret to success, and there isn't, but this is certainly an important one. I'm not going to go through this, but this is sort of, I was trying to outline my own checkered career, and there were 18 things that I really wanted to achieve or accomplish or gain during the 50 years of my career. And 2 or 3 of them I failed to do because the gate slammed closed and I simply couldn't stick with it anymore. But of the 15, 8 required trying more than once, knocking on the door again, not being discouraged, not walking away, not tucking my tail between my legs and saying, oh, well, I failed and I guess that's that. But saying, damn it, you have not seen the last of me. And that is, for a person who's short on talent, and I'm not being modest here, for a person who is interested in succeeding but who is not innately, astoundingly talented, this is the secret that I'd like to make the takeaway for this talk. I see upturned faces in a situation where I was sitting a half-century ago, and maybe my life wouldn't have been changed by hearing that. Maybe yours won't either, but that's my message for today. The first item was when, of course, I'm a Texan, so Santa Fe, New Mexico was a place that I just felt that I had to be, I had to go, I had to live. And so I moved after graduation to Santa Fe, and I moved someplace first and then looked for a job. I don't do it the other way, never have. So I walked to the door of the office of the best architect in Santa Fe, and I said, I'm here, hire me. All right, those were the days, right? And Philippe Register, who was tall and handsome and suave, and the gentleman architect, who was known as in Santa Fe, said, well, that's all well and good, but you know, this is a brand new office. I don't have any work. You may have heard that before. I don't have any work. So I turned around and started to leave, and he said, and why should I hire you anyway? I said, well, you know, I graduated top of my class with an AIE medal, and I know you went to Yale, and I want to go to Yale. And he said, well, why didn't you say so? So I was, not for very long, but I was hired for a while. There's, in fact, the watercolor rendering in the show upstairs is one that I did for him, because he really didn't have any work. But he said to me after that, don't, quoting or paraphrasing the Bible, don't keep your light under a bushel. If you've got something that should be said, say it. Modesty is a good thing generally in moderation, but too much modesty does not further your cause. That's a lesson I learned right there, and increased, I think I could say, certainly during my time at Harvard, increased apace as the years went on. So the time in Santa Fe was absolutely wonderful. I skied my brains out. I worked for the best architect in town. I dated an English exchange teacher who took it upon herself to educate me in ways that I was more than willing to learn. Hell of a year, I gotta say. So I started out loving Santa Fe, but I ended up really thinking it was, you know, it was really the cat's pajamas. Well, except in one respect, and that was to make a living. That is, to be an architect in Santa Fe at that time meant you just did pueblos and, you know, little tiny windows. And that really wasn't what I was interested in. But at that time, I did get a real commission from a real client. And this is my first floor plan that was done in Anger for a lifelong friend of the family, the Pennycook family. And for 53 years, Ruth Pennycook lived in this house, which looked like this. It actually has fences around it and stuff like that now. But for 53 years, until she died this last August. So how's that for a post-occupancy evaluation? She loved the house from the time it was built in '61 till the time she passed away, which I think is just wonderful. She was very, very close. She was kind of a second mother. You'd probably pick this up. So here I was in Santa Fe, no money. I was making $2 an hour. My mother had no money. She had just been divorced. We were sharing rent. We had a shared beat-up old gray Volkswagen Beetle. And I got a call from the Yale regional rep. Well, I had applied to Yale, as well as some other graduate schools, right out of Tech. And I'd gotten accepted everywhere except Yale, which is the place I wanted to go, because 3 reasons. Ed McCollum was my thesis advisor here at Tech, 5th year. And Philippe Register, I've already mentioned, was a Penn and Yale graduate. And also Eros Saarinen, who was a hero of mine, was in the neighborhood, in New Haven. He wasn't on the faculty, but he spent a lot of time at Yale. And as I say, he was someone I really wanted to get closer to. So Yale was the target. So this guy, this rep, said, well, look, are you serious? And I said, yeah, I'm serious. And he said, well, you've got to go to New Haven for the interview. I said, oh, wow, that's That's a long way from Santa Fe. And he said, well, you know, if you're serious, that's what you got to do. So I told my mother, she said, you know what, we don't have any money, but I have a banker. I'm going to go to the banker and ask if he'll cover my checks. He'll float me. He'll float us. He said, Suda, you have a kid who might go to Yale. Go for it. Wow. Imagine that happening now. Okay, into the little gray beetle with the Cocker Spaniel in the back. My mother and I drove 3 days. Arrived on Sunday night, the night before the Monday morning interview. And we were staying at the Duncan Hotel, which is across the street from the architecture school, which is where the interview was being held. And my mother said, this was 9:30 or 10 at night, said, well, what are you going to wear? And I said, well, I'm going to wear my suit. I had one suit. So he said, put it on. I said, Mom. So I put on an old gray baggy flannel suit. And she said, no, it's not going to do. I said, Mother, the interview's at 9 o'clock in the morning. This is 10 o'clock at night. You know, what are we talking about here? She said, it's not going to work. 7 o'clock the next morning, we were at J Press, Gentleman's Clothier, downstairs from the hotel that we were in. And she was banging on the door. I mean, my mother was irrepressible. She was a force of nature. So to the door came a little Jewish shopkeeper with a tape measure around his neck and said, lady, if you're not open, if you don't open till 9. And she said, if you don't open for us, you're going to miss the best sale of the day. And he said, as I recall, it's probably not exactly that, but I think he said, oi. So yes, the door opened, and 45 minutes later, I was outfitted in the coolest, the most up-to-the-moment Ivy League suit with a buckle in the back. You may remember that. I was almost a new person, not quite. She said, well, you know what, those shoes are never going to do. They're just, now that you've got this, you know, really, really great suit from there up, those shoes really look tatty. I said, Mother, the interview's in 20 minutes. Next door, we go to Barry's Gentleman's Booter, English Booter. And I was outfitted in the coolest shoes that I had ever owned. And you can believe it because I'm wearing them right now. So I walked into the interview. King Louis Wu was my interviewer. Absolutely blew it away. And I was admitted to the master's class in 1962 at Yale. I think it was probably the fact that I had done a house in Santa Fe and actually gotten it built more than the clothes, but the clothes maybe make a better story. But wow, what a pivotal moment in my life, because I probably would not have tried it again, but it did represent the second try, that's my point. I didn't take no for an answer the first time, and I got a chance to finally go to Yale. Well, this was not what I really bargained for, because I had expected that I would be spending some time with Eros Saarinen. I inherited instead Paul Marvin Rudolph, who was known widely as not only a harsh, but even possibly a vicious critic. Indeed, certainly toward some people. My classmates were people like Norman Foster, who you may have heard of, and Richard Rogers. And Rudolph was so devastatingly destructive in juries and took great pleasure in this. I think his mantra was, if I can destroy a student's self-confidence, then it should be destroyed. That was his calling, that was his responsibility, and he took it seriously, and he did it very well. So the net result for me was that I failed, after having graduated, top of my class here, I failed project after project after project because there was a personal animus involved. I'm not going to go into that. Richard Rogers and Norman Foster did, in fact, pass, but Foster was at one point brought to tears by Rudolph. I mean, that's actually kind of famous lore. So it was rough. So the end of the year came, and it's supposed to be a one-year course. And I failed the year because I'd failed so many projects. And here was another case where just simply plain old stubbornness came to my aid. I said, look, I can either leave with my tail between my legs, or I can demand another semester, another term, to prove that, you know, that I can do the work, I can succeed. So luck would have it, and Paul Rudolph took a leave of absence, which is one of the greatest blessings of my life. And I inherited then Serge Chermayeff, who was a wonderful old phlegmatic Russian. We got along splendidly. I rose back to my accustomed place at the top of the class and walked out of Yale University with an honorable Master of Architecture. So if I had not been tenacious at that point, I am not exactly sure what would have happened. Of course, one never knows about the road not taken. But I would imagine that I would not be standing here. So I was not a great fan of Walter Adolf Georg Gropius, because as you could probably see from my residence, I was a fan, and still am, of the Taliesin crowd, we could say, of Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, when I was at Tech, I wrote an essay comparing Wright and Gropius, and Gropius came off very, very badly indeed in the comparison. But here I was. My first job was at the Architects Collaborative in Cambridge, and is this too loud? Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing differently. So I walked in the door of the Architects Collaborative, and the next thing I knew was I heard somebody whispering behind my back, "He can draw corners." What's that? Well, the Bauhaus, and of course this was Gropius, didn't do perspective. They only did orthographic drawings. They only did, elevations and plans and figure field and all those good Bauhaus kinds of things. And I was the only guy apparently in the firm, and it turned out later, practically the only guy in town who could actually draw perspectives, because that's what they taught at Texas Tech. So I was put into a tiny room with a table in the middle that was just big enough for 3 people, 1 drafting station, and the other 2 people were German speakers. One was, you got it already, was Walter Adolf Georg Gropius. Not my hero, but I was still extremely heady. It was a very, very heady experience to be in a small room with one of the great architects of the 20th century. So the first project was the one that's upstairs, you can see right now, later. A competition for the city of Frankfurt, Germany, city center. And it was an international competition, and of course I knew that we were going to win this thing because, gosh, everything had happened so well in Gropius' studio. It turns out, though, that, and we talked about being deadline driven, Andy. You asleep?
Oh.
Good. Gotcha.
Throwing a rice rag.
Talked about being deadline driven. Well, I could see that these guys, these 2 German guys, were just talking about, Gropius was a German guy, was talking and talking and talking. It was when I was introduced to the concept of talkitecture, but no drawings were being done. And the deadline was approaching, and so one night, no, 2 nights, a weekend, I went in and I tried to interpret all the German and English that I'd heard and drew up the whole project. And I was very scared to do this because I wasn't asked to do it. And that was on a weekend, and Grote came in on Monday morning, and I was slinking into a corner, you know, wondering what the heck he was going to say about this work that was done by the Gremlins over the weekend. So he always arrived exactly on time. He's, you know, Germanic. And he walked for about 3 minutes, which seemed to me was about 3 hours, around the table, looking at every drawing very carefully. And then he uttered words that were as memorable to me as I Pei's words later, and that is, "Ja, we use it." So I thought, whoa, you know, this is the beginning of a stellar career. We're going to win this puppy, and we're going to, you know, I'm going to replace Frank Lloyd Wright after all. Well, we didn't scratch. So basically, I had to go to Plan B, which was to enter competitions on my own. This was a drawing that I did for the Roach Traveling Scholarship, which was the most prestigious competition in the Boston area. For any of you in the room who have spent any time there, you probably recognize that. It was extremely well received by the jury. I got a page and a half of positive comments, rave comments about the design, the presentation, thinking, etc. And then they gave the prize to somebody else. So again, I thought, I'm not going to take no for an answer, so I entered the next year. I was also runner-up that year, and then the Iron Gate closed because it was only people under 31 years old, so I couldn't, you know, that was one of my failures. But there's another option here, and that is I submitted that drawing to the Birch Burdett Lawn Prize, which is founded by the Architecture League of New York, and it won. So I didn't win as a designer, but I did win as an illustrator. So that began to sort of suggest something to me. And that's the reason, since I was kind of tired of working for firms that just wanted me because I could draw pictures, they didn't want me as a designer. I mean, that's the way I took it anyway. That I thought, well, look, if I'm going to draw pictures, which is not something I really want to do, I want to do it for people who I really respect nationally. So I put together a very cheeky thing, an unsolicited letter to my 5 favorite architects, the architects whom I respected the most in the country. And actually one of them was a person, an architect, who established his firm in the year of my birth, in the city of my birth. That was 1936 in San Antonio, Texas, happened to be the designer, or at least almost the designer, of the building we're standing in. O'Neill Ford was one of the letters that I sent. But I think by now you probably know that the letter that got a response was this one to Ian Pei. I never kept an original or a copy of that. I was given this by the office actually fairly recently. But it's a historical piece now. It really sort of triggered that phone call that you saw in the video, which obviously was the beginning of a whole career. It was the beginning of the rest of my life. So at the time, we're almost done. Good for you. You're still awake, Andy?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good, good. It's a little slow in the response time, but I think it's... So at the time, for 2 years, I was the Institute architect for MIT, and my main task was to rationalize the sort of wayfinding and the orientation of those famously labyrinthine corridors at the Institute. And since Q by color was in the air because I'd worked on the MBTA master plan. MBTA is the transit system, and of course that's all color-coded now. This seemed like a natural solution. So very shortly after that, 1971, I opened my own office, a tiny little slot of space. This is only 9 feet wide. And that's where I worked for 30 years. And most of the work that you'll see upstairs was done, you know, at these desks.
And I have visited.
Sorry?
I have visited.
You have visited, right. That's kind of, well, it was a wide-angle lens, so it looked bigger here than it really was. But people see this and say, don't you ever do any work? You know, I mean, it's too clean. This is not an architect's office. Well, the last thing I'd like to end on is an invitation to any of you who are interested in entering the student version of the ASAI annual competition, because although if you read at the bottom, the professional version has already passed. Deadline for the professional version, but the student version submissions are not due until the 9th of February, which is, what, 11 days away. So anybody who would be interested in entering the student version of this competition, please, as they say, see me after class. I have the material. I can hook you to the right material. There is one more story I'd like to go into prior to closing and turning off the video, and then we can talk and have questions or whatever you'd like to do. And that is, when I co-founded the organization in 1984, it started very small and got quite big, and now it's actually very legitimate. But I not only co-founded, but I founded the Best in Show Prize, which was named the Hugh Ferris Memorial Prize, which I thought, well, I founded this prize, but I can't really enter, and I certainly shouldn't win it the first thing out of the box. So I thought, I'll wait 4 years before I enter and, you know, win the Ferris. Because I'd won the Birch Burdett Lawn twice, and I was pretty good by that time, so I figured, well, I can win my own, you know, my own award. Well, there are several levels of awards. There's the Ferris, which is the big one, then there are 5 or 6 Jurors Awards and whatnot. And then there's a great sort of long list of also-rans that constitute the exhibition, which travels all around, and also is included in the catalog, which is published with every show. So I thought, okay, now's the time. 5 years out, I submitted something. I didn't even get in the show. There were 500 entries, and I didn't even scratch. So I thought, well, something's wrong. This is a funny jury, and the jury changes every year, so it'll be different next year. So I entered next year, best work I had. I didn't even get in the show. You know, never mind. So I'm happy to say that after 10 years, I finally not only got in the show, but won the damn Ferris. So that was a victory again, an exercise in tenacity, and you'll see a very good print of this drawing upstairs. So in conclusion, probably happy to hear me say that. I am followed by a reminder of the school I came from and the school we're in right now. Certainly I owe a lot to Yale because it opened some doors. It was an opportunity to be tempered by opprobrium. It was an opportunity to forge my resolve and my own tenacity. But it's here that I got the stuff that really matters, and matters to this day. It's this widely respected and very beloved institution, which is my alma mater and yours. Thank you.